The third and final operation of the year was far more ambitious than the others, neither of which had given the fleet the large, deep-water harbor it needed in order to maintain a year-round blockade of such busy ports as Wilmington, Charleston, and Savannah. About one-third of the way up the palmetto-studded 100 miles of South Carolina, Laurel lying between the two latter cities, the Strategy Board found what it was seeking: Port Royal. The finest natural harbor on the southern coast, would float the navies of the world. Obviously, however, though there had no real need for it themselves, having almost no navy, the Confederates were thoroughly aware of what covetous eyes the Union Navy was casting in that direction. If it was to be undertaken, the job must be done in strength, after preparation and great secrecy. Both were provided for. The board took no chances to avoid it. The naval member himself, Captain Samuel F. DuPont, was appointed to head the expedition of 74 vessels, including transports for the land force of 12,000 men. In late October, sailing under sealed orders, his fleet put out from Hampton Roads, considerable pains having been taken to conceal its destination. Almost at once, DuPont was struck a double blow by fate, in the form of Confederate intelligence and the weather. He not only lost the advantages of secrecy, he came close to losing his fleet as well. On the day he put out, the Richmond government alerted its coastal defenses, giving warning that the force had sailed. 3 days later, November 1st, the defenders of the fleet's objective received a specific telegram. The enemy's expedition is intended for Port Royal. On the same day, the fleet ran into a gale off Hatteras. The wind approaching hurricane strength, 2 of the ships went down, and the crew of a third had to heave her guns into the sea to keep from floundering. On November 2nd, the fleet was so scattered that DuPont could sight but one sail from the deck of his flagship, the Wabash. He continued southward, however, in the clear water. 2 days later, dropped anchor off the bar at Port Royal. 25 of his ships had rejoined by then, together with reinforcements from the Charleston squadron, and others kept bobbing up along the horizon. He spent another 2 days replacing the rebel-destroyed channel markers, crossing the bar, a dangerous business for the deep-draft Wabash, completing his attack plan, and finally holding a conference at which he outlined for his captains the order of battle. At last he was ready, and at 8 o'clock the following morning, November 7th, the attack got underway. He knew what his wooden ships would encounter. At the entrance of Port Royal Sound, the enemy held Fort Beauregard, mounting 20 guns on Bay Point to the north, and Fort Walker, mounting 23 guns on Hilton Head to the south. Less than 3 miles apart, both of these forts were strongly built, their gunners alerted for a week, awaiting the opportunity DuPont was about to offer them. Somewhere beyond them, too, was a Confederate flotilla of 3 tugs, mounting 1 gun each, and a converted river steamer under Commodore Hosea Tatnall, whom DuPont knew to be a bold and capable officer, having messed with him in what was already known as the Old Navy. The forts were DuPont's main concern, however, and, in attempting their reduction, he would have no help from the 3 brigades of soldiers in the transports. Not only were these landsmen still somewhat green about the gills as the result of their experience off Hatteras, but in that storm, along with much else, they had lost nearly all their landing craft. It was to be a job for the naval force alone. In fact, DuPont preferred it so. The most he would ask of his army was that it stand by to help pick up the pieces. To accomplish the double reduction had involved a novel plan of attack. In order of battle which divided his fighting force into a main squadron of 9 of the heaviest frigates and sloops, ranged in line ahead, and a flanking squadron of 5 gunboats. They would enter the Sound in parallel columns, the lighter squadron ranged to starboard, and pass midway between the forts, receiving and returning fire of both. At a point about 2 miles beyond the entrance, the main force was to round by the south and come back west, moving slowly past Fort Walker, maintaining the heaviest possible fire, then round to the north and head back east, slowing again as it passed Fort Beauregard. The flanking squadron, meanwhile, was to peel off and engage the Confederate flotilla and whatever targets of opportunity the rebels might afford, while the main force kept both forts under fire, widening the elliptical attack so as to bring its guns in closer on every turn. And so it was. At the signal from the commander on the Wabash, leading the way across the sunlit water, the fleet steamed forward, two columns in close order. A flash and a roar shot out from Fort Walker, echoed at once by Beauregard. The ships took up the challenge and the fight was on. As they neared the turning point, Tatnall brought his four makeshift warships down the Sound, and from a raking position let go several broadsides at the Wabash as soon as she came within range. The gunboats gave him their attention then, whereupon the Confederate, with 14 Union men of war, to his immediate front, discreetly came about and made a swift, flat-bottom retreat up Skull Creek, 3 miles northwest of the fort on Hilton Head. He was out of the fight for good, bottled up by the gunboats, which took station off the creek mouth. According to a Savannah newspaper published 5 days later, Tatnall dipped his pennant 3 times in jaunty salute to his old messmate, regretting his inability to return the high-flow compliment of the flag officers DuPont in a more satisfactory manner. By then, the Federal captain was busy elsewhere, with little time for compliments, high-flown or otherwise. As the main column turned south, beginning its first eastward run, each ship opened with its forward pivot against Fort Walker's northern flank, which DuPont had learned from reconnaissance was its weakest. The cannon being lodged on the parapet, which, if it increased their range, also increased their vulnerability. Several were violently dismounted, others lost their crews, and the gunners, thus taken by enfilade from a direction in which they had not expected to fight, were dismayed. A British correspondent on one of the Union ships saw tall columns of dust spring up from the fort to mark the hits the fleet was scoring, and it looked to him as if we had suddenly raised from the dust a grove of poplars. Not that the rebel gunnery had been very effective in the first place. The enemy ships, moving along their elliptical course with constant change of speed, range, and deflection, were extremely hard to hit. What was more, the defenders had not wasted their scant powder on anything as unprofitable as target practice, and now that it came to bloody work, they found that many of the shells would not fit, the powder was inferior, and the crews became exhausted within an hour of opening fire. All of which, sad as it was in Confederate eyes, was really quite beside the point. Fort Walker, to which Fort Beauregard, across the water, was merely adjunct, had been built to be defended only from dead ahead, against a force moving straight in from the sea. When this became apparent, it became apparent, too, that the fight had been lost from the moment DuPont conceived his plan of attack. The only conditions left to be satisfied were those of honor. Erratic or deadly, the firing continued, and as the main squadron steamed slowly past Fort Walker, delivering broadsides at point-blank range, the flanking squadron, maintaining its watch over the mouth of the creek which Tatnall had retreated, added the weight of its guns to the pressure against the vulnerable northern flank, its shelling bowling down the line of metal on the parapet. Assailed from both directions by naval crews who worked with coolness and precision, more guns were dismounted, more men fell, the defenders fired even more wildly. The main squadron completed its first pass, closing upon Fort Beauregard, then swept down and around again, coming within less than 600 yards of the fort on Hilton Head, which had but 3 guns left in working order by the time the ships completed their second run. The Wabash was just rounding to the south, leading its way into the third ellipse, when DuPont received the message that Fort Walker had been abandoned. At 2:20, a naval landing party raised the Union flag above ramparts that were pocked and battered, strewn with wreckage left by men who would not sweat to keep from bleeding, and then had wound up doing both at once. Army transports now put in. By nightfall, the troops had occupied the works. Across the way, Fort Beauregard hauled down its flag at sunset, and early next morning the troops crossed over and occupied it too. The victory was complete, and by it the Navy Federal gained an excellent harbor in the very heart of secession.